The chime of the grand church bell echoed through the towering stone walls, reverberating like a solemn whisper of fate. White roses adorned the aisle, their soft petals drifting onto the floor beneath the flickering candlelight, casting an ethereal glow across the magnificent cathedral. Today was Lillian Astor's wedding day, but not the wedding she had dreamed of. She stood frozen in front of the grand mirror in the bridal suite, her amber eyes staring at the reflection of a bride too perfect to be real. The custom-made wedding gown clung to her slender figure, layers of hand-stitched lace and shimmering crystals cascading like a river of moonlight. Around her neck, the Astor family diamond necklace gleamed, a symbol of wealth and legacy, and a chain locking her in a life she never chose. Lillian Astor was not weak, but today she felt trapped. "Lillian," her father's voice echoed from the doorway. James Astor, a man whose sharp features mirrored the steel in his heart. His presence was commanding, unyielding, a figure who did not tolerate rebellion. "It's time. Don't make me repeat myself." Lillian turned to face him, her eyes meeting his cold, unfeeling gaze. There was no tenderness, no fatherly concern, only a business transaction in which she was the most valuable commodity. "You're really going to force me into this?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet defiance. James sighed, stepping closer, placing a firm hand on her shoulder, a possessive, suffocating grip. "It's not force, Lillian. It's duty." Duty. The word struck her like a blade. "I am not a pawn in your game, Father." Her nails dug into her palms, her voice trembling but unbroken. She had fought against this for months, but her pleas had fallen on deaf ears. Her mother had died years ago. She was alone now. James' patience thinned. His expression darkened. "If you refuse this marriage, you will destroy everything your mother and I built. Do you really want that?" Lillian stiffened. He was using her mother against her. She wanted to scream, to rip the wedding dress off, to smash the mirror and run. But there was nowhere to go. They had sealed off every possible escape route. And waiting at the altar was Damian Whitmore. Damian Whitmore. The name had haunted her for months. He was powerful, ruthless, and terrifyingly perfect. His face was carved with sharp precision, jet-black hair slicked back, piercing gray eyes that held no warmth, lips sculpted into a cruel smirk. To the world, he was a billionaire heir, a brilliant businessman, the untouchable king of the financial empire. But to her, he was the man who had bought her. Damian didn't love her. Damian didn't know how to love. This marriage wasn't about romance. It was a calculated move. He needed a wife with status, a woman with impeccable lineage, someone who would enhance his empire. To him, she was just another acquisition. But she was not his possession. She would not be caged. Damian Whitmore. The name had haunted her for months. He was powerful, ruthless, and terrifyingly perfect. His face was carved with sharp precision, jet-black hair slicked back, piercing gray eyes that held no warmth, lips sculpted into a cruel smirk. To the world, he was a billionaire heir, a brilliant businessman, the untouchable king of the financial empire. But to her, he was the man who had bought her. Damian didn't love her. Damian didn't know how to love. This marriage wasn't about romance. It was a calculated move. He needed a wife with status, a woman with impeccable lineage, someone who would enhance his empire. To him, she was just another acquisition. But she was not his possession. She would not be caged. Lillian clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. "You think I have no choice, don't you?" "You don't." James's voice was unwavering. "You can either walk down that aisle and marry Damian, or you can disgrace your mother's memory." Lillian shuddered. He didn't love her. He only loved power. She turned back to the mirror. The breathtaking white gown, the elegant updo, the shimmering diamonds on her throat. A perfect bride, a prisoner in a golden cage. No, she wouldn't let them win. Underneath the heavy gown, she had hidden a small blade, sharp enough to cut away the fabric if she needed to run. Inside her towering wedding heels, she had tucked away a tiny key. And inside her heart, she was ready to fight. Because if she didn't escape tonight, she would lose everything. A knock came at the door. A maid curtsied, her voice soft but urgent. "Miss Astor, it's time." Lillian inhaled deeply. She placed a hand over her chest, where her heart pounded wildly, not just from fear but from anticipation. "Not yet," she whispered, "but very soon." And then, with slow, deliberate steps, she walked out of the room. Because she knew. Her battle had only just begun. The grand cathedral was suffocating. Every flickering candle, every murmuring guest, every expectant gaze bore down on her like 1,000 invisible chains. At the end of the aisle stood Damian Whitmore. Cold, calculated, unbothered. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his sharp features unreadable as he waited for his bride like a man sealing a business deal. Lillian's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a contract. The orchestra swelled. The doors opened. And Lillian Astor, the unwilling bride, took her first step. But she wasn't walking toward marriage. She was walking toward her escape. Step by step, she glided down the aisle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The guests sighed in admiration. She was flawless, elegant, controlled, obedient. But inside, she was screaming. James Astor sat in the front row, his expression smug. He believed she had surrendered. He believed he had won. Fool. As she neared the altar, she stole a glance at the side door. A guard stood there, watching her every move. Damn it, she was running out of options. She turned her gaze to Damian. His silver eyes locked onto hers, intense, unreadable. Did he suspect? Did he know? Or was he just as indifferent as she feared? The priest began the vows. "Do you, Damian Whitmore, take Lillian Astor to be your lawful wife?" Damian's voice was smooth, unwavering. "I do." The world spun. Her turn, her moment, the final second before she shattered the illusion. "And do you, Lillian Astor, take Damian Whitmore?" She took a step back. "No." Gasps erupted. Her father's face turned to stone. Damian's eyes flashed with something unreadable. "I don't." And then, chaos. The whispers turned to shouts. James lunged to his feet, his voice cutting through the cathedral like a whip. "Lillian, don't you dare!" She didn't wait. She ran. The gown was heavy, but she didn't stop. She ripped the veil from her head, tore the diamond necklace from her throat, and bolted for the nearest exit. Security surged forward. Guests gasped. "Stop her!" James roared. No one was stopping her. She burst through the grand doors, the cold night air slicing into her skin. The streets outside were quiet, dimly lit by street lamps. She had a plan. She had prepared. But she hadn't prepared for him. A black car idled at the curb. A man leaned against it, dressed in a crisp black suit, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a cigarette lazily hanging from his fingers. Tall, lean, dangerous, and watching her. Lillian skidded to a stop. Her chest heaved. "You're late," he said, his voice deep, teasing. Adrian Kane, a name whispered in dark corners, a name her father hated, a man her father feared. Lillian's lips parted. "You—" Adrian flicked his cigarette away. "Get in the car, princess, unless you'd rather let your father drag you back inside." A storm of footsteps pounded behind her. She had seconds. Lillian hesitated. Adrian's eyes locked onto hers. "Trust me." Trust him. He was a stranger, a criminal, a man with secrets, but at that moment, he was her only way out. Lillian threw herself into the car. The door slammed, the engine roared, and as they sped into the dark streets, leaving her father's empire behind, she knew her life would never be the same again. The city stretched endlessly beneath them, a sea of glittering lights and restless streets. Lillian sat motionless in the leather seat, her heart hammering against her ribs, her pulse still erratic from her escape. Adrian Kane drove with effortless confidence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting casually on the gear shift. The neon glow of the city flickered across his sharp features, casting fleeting shadows over his unreadable expression. She had just ruined her father. She had humiliated Damian Whitmore. And now, she was sitting beside a man far more dangerous than either of them. The silence between them was suffocating. "You're awfully quiet, Princess," Adrian finally said, his voice smooth, edged with amusement. "Not having second thoughts, are you?" Lillian's hands curled into fists in her lap. Second thoughts? Number she had walked away from a life of suffocating control. There was no going back. But was this any better? "Why were you outside the cathedral?" she asked, her voice steady. Adrian smirked, tapping his fingers against the wheel. "Waiting for you, obviously." Her stomach tightened. "How did you know I was going to run?" "Because I know your father." The air in the car grew heavier. Lillian turned to him, her chest tightening at the certainty in his tone. "What does that mean?" Adrian's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, the only visible crack in his otherwise effortless composure. "It means James Astor made the wrong enemy." A chill ran down her spine. "And what does that make me?" she asked. "Collateral damage?" Adrian's smirk faded. For the first time, his eyes met hers fully. Dark, intense, and unreadable. "That depends," he said, his voice quieter now. "On whether you want revenge." Her breath caught. The car pulled into an underground garage, the sleek hum of the engine the only sound in the stillness. Adrian stepped out first, moving with an effortless kind of power. Lillian hesitated. She was alone. No allies, no safety net. But she had been alone for years. She stepped out. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, save for the faint hum of the city below. When the doors slid open, Lillian was momentarily struck by the sheer elegance of the space. Dark marble, glass walls, a view of the entire city. It was the kind of place owned by someone who controlled empires. Adrian poured himself a drink, watching her with quiet amusement. "You're free to leave whenever you want," he said, taking a slow sip. "But you and I both know you won't make it far." Lillian forced herself to stay calm. "You still haven't told me what you want from me." Adrian set his glass down. "Your father built his empire on stolen power, stolen money, stolen lives." Her stomach twisted. "So you want to take him down?" "I plan to," Adrian corrected, "with or without you." His gaze locked onto hers, sharp and knowing. "But with you, it'll be a hell of a lot easier." The weight of his words pressed against her. If she left now, her father would drag her back into the life she had barely escaped. If she stayed, she would be walking straight into war. "And if I help you?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Adrian stepped closer. "Then we burn him to the ground." Lillian exhaled slowly. She had spent her entire life being used as a pawn. But for the first time, she had a chance to be the one pulling the strings. She looked up at Adrian Kane, the man her father feared most. "Then let's make a deal." His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Good girl." And just like that, The game began. The air inside the penthouse felt electric, crackling with unspoken tension. Lillian could still feel the weight of Adrian's woe. Then we burn him to the ground. Her father, James Astor. The man who had spent years controlling her, using her as a pawn, and forcing her into a life she never wanted. And now, here she was, standing beside a man just as dangerous, just as powerful, but offering her something no one else ever had. A choice. Adrian poured himself another drink, the ice clinking softly in the crystal glass. His movements were calm, composed, like a man who always got exactly what he wanted. "So tell me, princess," he mused, leaning against the bar, watching her with those unreadable dark eyes. "How far are you willing to go?" Lillian inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "As far as it takes." A slow smirk played on Adrian's lips, but there was something else in his gaze, a flicker of approval. "Good answer." But before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting instantly. "We have a problem." Lillian tensed. "What kind of problem?" Adrian picked up the phone, his jaw tightening. "Your father knows you're missing." Her stomach clenched. Of course he did. "How bad is it?" she asked, trying to mask the unease in her voice. Adrian looked at her, his gaze assessing. "He's put every private security firm he owns on high alert. He'll lock the city down if he has to." Lillian swallowed hard. This wasn't just a man searching for his runaway daughter. This was a hunt. Adrian grabbed his jacket, his movements sharp and decisive. "We need to move." Lillian's breath hitched. "Move where?" Adrian didn't hesitate. "Somewhere he can't touch you." He strode past her, but she caught his wrist before he could reach the door. "Wait. You just said I have a choice, right?" she challenged. "Then let me make one." Adrian's gaze flickered down to her hand, then back to her face. Something dangerous sparked in his eyes. "All right, princess. I'm listening." Lillian exhaled slowly. "If my father is going to hunt me down no matter where I go, then let's not run." Adrian raised a brow. "Interesting. Go on." Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she kept her voice steady. "He expects me to be scared, to hide. But what if we make him think I'm not the one running?" Adrian's smirk deepened. "You want to flip the game on him?" Lillian lifted her chin. "I want him to know that I'm done playing by his rules." Adrian chuckled lowly, stepping closer, his presence suffocating in the best way. "Now that, princess, is the first smart thing you've said all night." A thrill shot through her veins. For the first time, she wasn't the girl trapped in a cage. She was the one holding the key, and James Astor had no idea what was coming. The city skyline stretched before them, an endless sea of flickering lights and restless shadows. Lillian stood on the penthouse balcony, the cool night air wrapping around her like a second skin. She should have been afraid. Her father was hunting her. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in the city. And she was standing beside someone just as ruthless. But instead of fear, she felt something else. Power. Behind her, Adrian Kane leaned against the balcony railing, watching her with quiet amusement. "You're enjoying this," he observed. Lillian turned to him, her eyes glinting under the city lights. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm the one making the moves." Adrian's lips quirked into a slow, knowing smirk. "Then let's make the next one count." Back inside, Adrian pulled out a sleek black folder, tossing it onto the glass table between them. Lillian glanced down, her pulse quickening as she read the name on the cover. Astor Industries. Confidential. She swallowed hard. How did you get this? Adrian leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I have my ways. Lillian hesitated. She had grown up surrounded by luxury, wealth, and power. But her father never let her see what was beneath it. The ugly truths, the hidden deals. And now, Adrian was handing them to her on a silver platter. You wanted to take him down, Adrian said, watching her closely. Now's your chance. Lillian's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Offshore accounts, shady investments, deals made with people whose names alone sent shivers down her spine. Her father wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable, because he had buried every crime under an empire built on fear. This is enough to destroy him, she murmured. Adrian took a slow sip of his drink. Number, it's enough to start a war. Their eyes met across the table. The air between them felt charged. A silent understanding passed between them. They weren't just going to expose James Astor, they were going to tear him apart from the inside out. Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're the perfect weapon against him. Lillian stiffened. Excuse me? Adrian's gaze was unwavering. You know his weaknesses, his allies, his enemies. You were raised in his world, but you're not loyal to it anymore. Lillian's nails dug into her palms. He was right. For years, she had been forced to smile at his associates, pretend she didn't notice when conversations shifted to things she wasn't supposed to hear. She knew where the bodies were buried, and now she could use it. So what's the plan? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Adrian's smirk returned, dark and full of promise. We cut off his power, one piece at a time. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't a game. This was war, and she had just chosen a side. The air inside the penthouse was thick with tension. Lillian stood by the window, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of her wine glass. The city below stretched endlessly, the bright lights glowing like tiny embers in the darkness. But her world was no longer as steady as the streets beneath her. James Astor was fighting back. Adrian paced behind her, his jaw clenched as he read the new reports coming in. He's already making his move, he muttered. Lillian turned, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? He tossed the tablet onto the coffee table. On the screen, the latest headlines flashed in bold letters. Lillian Astor accused of corporate espionage, a father's betrayal or a daughter's crime. Her stomach dropped. He's framing me, she whispered. Adrian nodded, his expression grim. Not just that. He's freezing your accounts, discrediting you in the business world, and making sure no one trusts you. By tomorrow, you'll be the villain in every newspaper. Lillian's hands trembled. James Astor wasn't going to beg her to come back. He was going to destroy her. Adrian walked over, gripping her shoulders firmly. His touch was grounding, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. Listen to me, he said. We knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. But this? He gestured at the screen. This means he's desperate. Lillian swallowed hard. Desperate men made dangerous moves. We need to end this, she said, her voice steel. Adrian's lips curled into a slow, approving smirk. Then let's hit him where it hurts. The Astor family estate had always been a symbol of power, a fortress of wealth and influence, with towering gates and sprawling gardens that whispered secrets of a dynasty built on control. Tonight, Lillian wasn't walking through those gates as a daughter. She was walking in as a threat. Adrian drove the sleek black car up the long, winding driveway. He was silent, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Lillian sat beside him, her heart pounding, but her mind was clear. James Astor had spent years controlling her life. Now it was her turn. When they reached the entrance, Security guards stepped forward, blocking their path. But before they could speak, the doors to the mansion opened, and James Astor himself stepped out. "Lillian," he said smoothly, his deep voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I was wondering when you'd come home." Lillian stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the marble steps as she walked toward him. "Cut the act, Father." James chuckled. "What act, darling? You're the one who ran off to play rebel." Lillian's fists clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You're losing, and you know it. That's why you had to frame me. That's why you're scrambling to keep control." James's smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. "Control isn't something you lose, Lillian. It's something you take back." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I've given you a choice. Come back, and all of this disappears. The media storm, the lawsuits, the damage." Lillian stared at him, and for the briefest second, she saw it. Fear. Not of her, of losing her, of losing everything. She could walk back inside, sign his contracts, be the obedient daughter again. Or, she turned to Adrian, the man who had stood beside her when no one else had, the man who had fought for her, with her. And suddenly, the choice wasn't difficult at all. Lillian turned back to her father and smiled. "You taught me something important, Father." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Lillian took a step forward, looking him straight in the eye. "You taught me that power isn't about money. It's not about fear. It's about knowing when to walk away." Then, before he could speak, she pulled a small USB drive from her pocket. "This?" She held it up. "This has enough evidence to bury you." James's face finally faltered. Lillian leaned in, lowering her voice. "You have two options, Father. One, you fight me and you lose. Or two, you step down, you let it all go, and you disappear." The silence stretched between them, thick as a noose tightening around his empire. Finally, after what felt like forever, James exhaled. "You really are my daughter," he murmured. And for the first time in her life, Lillian felt free. She turned, stepping back toward Adrian, and without another glance behind her, she walked away. James Astor was finished. The wind was soft against her skin as she stood on the rooftop, the city stretching endlessly below. It felt different tonight, lighter, like the weight of the world had finally been lifted. Adrian leaned against the railing beside her, watching her with quiet amusement. "So," he said. "Now what?" Lillian smiled, tilting her head to the side. "Now, I start over." Adrian's smirk softened. "And where does that leave me?" She turned to him, studying his face, the sharp angles, the confidence, the warmth hidden beneath his smirk. "That depends," she murmured. "Do you plan on sticking around?" Adrian chuckled, stepping closer. "Princess, I wasn't planning on going anywhere." His hand brushed against hers, and for once, Lillian didn't hesitate. She reached up, threading her fingers through his hair as she pulled him into a kiss. It was slow, deep, full of everything they had fought for. Adrian smiled against her lips. "So does this mean I win?" Lillian pulled back, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Oh, Adrian," she whispered. "This was never about winning." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. It was about finding something worth fighting for. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other under the glow of the city lights, she realized she had found it. Him, them, a new beginning. What a journey. From betrayal to redemption, from war to love, Lillian's story proves that true strength lies in knowing when to fight and when to walk away. What would you have done in her place? Would you risk everything for freedom, or stay and reclaim power? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Love this story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more epic tales of love, ambition, and destiny. Because sometimes, the end of one chapter is just the beginning of something even greater.